So, going to talk topology, manual retopology by hand. A lot of people don't do it, especially in our field. I feel it's kind of a overlooked thing because a lot of people are doing so much MOA stuff where everything is just molecular. Everything's so abstract and just a bunch of blobs where it's not really necessary. But for us, because we do so much anatomy, I think it's a lot more useful to learn and do because it allows us to optimize our models a lot better and use them more broadly for animated things down the road. I think up to this point, a lot of the McGraw-Hill stuff, it's pretty well optimized, but there are some things that aren't, the edge flow isn't as good as it could be, or the mesh density is a little bit uneven in certain areas, so it wouldn't really be as suitable to like rig and animate. So I think starting from this current unit on the lower limb, we can start to really kind of focus more in on that. It would take a little bit more time, but not a ton more time, I hope, especially if, we can have multiple people doing a little bit, a structure here and there. And we could essentially have a more valuable asset in our library that we can do a little bit more with. So we're going to quickly just start from kind of some basic things with topology. The most ideal setup is basically, with quads, four-sided polygon. Each vertex, which is the points, meet with at 4 edges. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And also each polygon or each edge is only the convergence of 2 polygons. So 1, 2. And essentially it just forms a sheet. And that's the most ideal way to set things up. But when we have more advanced more complex models, it's just not really possible. It's kind of like trying to fold a present or gift wrap something. At some point, you're going to need to crease it and make folds and whatnot. And that's in 3D what we call a pole. So a pole is a point where we don't have 4 edges intersecting. So here, if I were to look at this corner point right here and draw it out, essentially this is 3 edges intersecting. You don't need to know what this is called. This is called an end pole. It's not really that as important as what it's called, as just recognizing what it is when we have 3 edges intersecting versus when we have 5. That's what we call an E-pole. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And they're not ideal, but they're also not avoidable. You can't really get rid of them. You can only change where they happen. So what you'd want to do is set up your model in a way where these poles would happen in areas that aren't going to be as visible. So for example, when you're retopologizing a face, usually people put the poles in like the corners of the eyes or the corners of the mouth or the back of the head where hair is usually covering. Because it's usually going to result in, when you start to subdivide it, it's going to result in a different density of polygons happening. If I were to turn that on, you can kind of see that it's relatively uniform on like a face like this, but then when we look at this pole area, we can see at the end pole, it's a little bit denser, and at the E pole, it's a little bit less dense. And that's usually not ideal when you're sculpting or laying down texture maps. Sometimes things, you get these weird little bumps on your model that aren't as ideal. It's not the worst thing in the world. It's got to happen somewhere, but if we can hide them, that's kind of the idea of good topology, is putting them in areas where it makes sense. For example, here, instead of having a, if we look at this one, the pole is moved by essentially getting rid of this quad here. So if I were to kind of do that from scratch, I could move that over, and draw out polygons like this. That actually I can do. And now I don't have those poles anymore. Because if we were to count them up now, oops, get rid of that. I can just count it like this. We only have 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So essentially, we're moving it to somewhere else. And when we subdivide, like we saw before, because we moved it, it's a lot more uniform throughout this area because we don't really need them here. Another thing too is that we try our best to work in all quads rather than triangles. Triangles, they're not ideal. It's not like it's illegal or anything. It's still going to work. You're still going to be able to UV unwrap. It's still going to texture, but really what a triangle is, it's just a pole that isn't really needed. If I were to go in and go here and then just draw a triangle, which, 2 triangles is a quad. So I had a triangle here. Really what I do when I subdivide, you can see when you subdivide, a triangle really is just a pole. And the way we would get a triangle is if the, I guess the hole that we're trying to fill has an odd number of edges. So to avoid them when we're laying down our polygon strips, we just need to count to make sure that we have an even number. You can see here, this hole has 3. To avoid it, we can delete that, and now we have a hole with 4 edges, and then we can fill that hole and get a quad rather than a triangle. And in this example, it seems pretty obvious because it's so simple, it's just a cube. But when we get into more complex forms, it gets a little bit harder to recognize. So when you're kind of laying down, that's usually how you start, is you start laying down strips of polygons. You want to make sure your strip, which is usually an enclosed loop, has an even number of edges. So let's talk about a few more things before we jump into it in practice. Is that there's a few other ways to kind of analyze a model in the viewport, which is handy. One of those things is you can view n-gons, which is, do I have it on? Why am I not seeing it? Oh, there we go. So in filter, it is n-gon lines. So what an n-gon is a face with more than 4 points. And again, those aren't really what we want. So if I were to then, let's say, draw in at a point here, you can see now by enabling that and filter n-gon lines, those blue lines, these light blue lines aren't actually part of my model. This is saying what I need to do to get rid of the n-gon, which the n-gon is, again, this shape right here, this polygon right here, because it has, if I go into vertex mode, you can see it has 5 points, which again isn't really ideal. And one of the reasons it's not ideal is because it's very easy to get non-planar polygons. For a polygon to be able to exist in the real world, it has to be planar, which means it's not being kind of distorted or wrinkled. You can see here, this wouldn't be possible to do this without bending this polygon, and that's kind of what this line is showing. It would be like folding a piece of paper. Essentially, it would be, it's impossible. And when you try and do this, it often results in like weird shading happening. If I were to do filter n-gon lines, you can see there's no line here, but it's still trying to shade it because it's not possible to figure out how to do this without adding more polygons to define this form. That's why you're getting this hard line right here, is because it's trying its best to figure out a way to shade it, but it's not really working. The only way to do it is by adding an edge. And then there, and even this isn't planar. Technically, to be planar, I'd have to add another one here. And then now it's able to actually exist. Without that, you're going to run into problems when you try and subdivide, when you try and shade things and add textures. It's just going to look bizarre. So that'd be considered bad topology. And a way to really kind of visualize that too is in mode modeling and do mesh checking. And you can see here, this lights up red because this is now a non-planar face. Non-planar polygons are highlighted in red. If I want to change the color, I can make it, more.
Jack, what did you select to get that? What is? I can't quite see it. What is that?
So it's mode. I go to modeling. In modeling, I'll lock it. I go to mesh checking, and then I enable check mesh. And these kind of allow you to analyze your mesh. This is really helpful when you have a lot of things going on in a more complex model. You might miss something. And this kind of alerts you to areas where there might be an issue. And here you can see there's a non-planar face where we have this n-gon that's kind of distorting this polygon in a way that wouldn't be possible because it's not on the same plane. I can fix it by just deleting it. And now they're all on the same plane again. So we have to be careful. But again, too, with complex models, it's not going to always be possible to get it perfectly in plane. And this doesn't really matter because when we go to subdivide things at render time or with normal maps to kind of shade things, we don't really need them to be perfect. They just need to be close enough. And this mesh checker, you can change the tolerance. Right now, the tolerance is set to 0, but we can raise it up as high as 30 degrees. And I feel like in that range, that's acceptable. Something like this is perfectly fine, especially on a pretty detailed model. If you go really crazy, then you can see now it's alerting us. It's saying, hey, this is like really distorted. We might want to fix this. Other things it can show is non-manifold geometry. Again, that's something that can't exist in the real world. A polygon is something that it kind of looks like, it's just a sheet of paper. It's just something really flat. But in reality, it's something that has 0 volume. If I were to go to like a plane, it looks like it's just a sheet of paper. And I should be able to, if I was modeling, just do something like this. And it would just be like gluing one piece of paper to another perpendicularly. But this is not really possible in 3D because this isn't a piece of paper. A piece of paper actually has thickness. It's just very thin, whereas a polygon has 0 volume. There's no thickness to it. So there's no way we could really do this in the real world, and this will cause issues with UV unwrapping. Pretty much most 3D packages, it'll get confused. It won't know how to UV unwrap this or shade it. For example, if I were to turn on Deformer here, you can see the shading just goes all crazy. It doesn't know what's going on. So that's not ideal. And it looks pretty obvious, like you could just spot it. But a lot of times this happens on the interior surface of a model, and you won't really know what's going on. So again, that's why it's kind of nice to have. If I go back to modeling, mesh checking, I go to that, you can see it's now showing me this red line there. That red line represents non-manifold geometry. If that's coming up, and usually, sometimes you won't notice it until you go to the UV mapping stage, and you'll go to hit unwrap, and it'll say, error, can't unwrap non-manifold geometry, and you'll be like, what the heck, where is it? I can't find it. One easy way to find it is by just doing this, going to mesh checking, going to non-manifold geometry. It says we have one edge that's non-manifold. I can hit this button, and it now selects it. And let's say, our model is complicated, we can't find it, another thing we can do is do cameras, view and frame selected elements, and it'll bring us right to it. And from there, we can find it and get rid of it. So that's pretty helpful.
How did you select, one more time, how did you use the modeling settings to check or to make that non-manifold geometry your selected object? That line segment.
All I have to do is hit these arrows right here, and that'll select it.
Yeah, I missed that. Okay, nice.
And then,
yeah, awesome.
if you find it, if you see the red line, then you can just go there and do it. If you can't find it, it helps to just do view selected elements, and it'll take you there.
Gotcha.
Same with any of the things in here. If you see a number here, it means that you have them present in your model, and by hitting that, you can select them.
That is super useful.
It would select all of them. So for example, boundary edges are green. If I were to hit boundary edge, now all the boundary edges are selected. Okay. And now it's selecting all of them. So that's kind of analyzing the mesh. So I think now we can kind of get into
just real quick.
Yeah.
The problem we ran into earlier with ZBrush with using UV master was with non-manifold geometry. As long as it's quads, it'll do it. It'll unwrap it perfectly. It gets in trouble when there's non-manifold, when you have a tri or anything that's non-manifold apparently. So anyhow, that's super.
That's definitely common. Same with Cinema4D, and I think a lot of other packages. It's pretty much everything else that I've talked about, like the non-planar and the points, like the end poles and the E poles. It's like they're not ideal, but you can still do them. That non-manifold is like the one thing that you really just can't do at any time. If you're trying to do a standard, workflow where you UV unwrap, texture, all that stuff. That's kind of like the one absolute don't break that rule. The poles you can do. You want to hide them. The non-planar you can do. You just don't want to do too much. The non-manifold you pretty much never want to do.
Roger.
So in practice, here we have the limb in progress. This is some of the stuff that I've been working on. And the way I work is usually I have the original things that we've kind of sculpted in ZBrush. And I'll go here. I think I'm going to duplicate everything, bring it into a new scene real quick. Copy. And what I'll do is I'll have the original group and then another group that I've, retopologized and kind of work that way, because what you want to do is you want to have your original object as a reference. And, sometimes it'll be, higher subdivision level or something that you just did in ZBrush with Dynamesh and stuff. And, sometimes I keep those original kind of blockouts as high as, 100,000 to 1,000,000 polygons as like a reference. I'll bring those in, and then I'll start laying polygons on top to start the retopologizing process. So to do that, I can do a quick example with the adductor brevis, because it's relatively simple. Delete that. And what I'm going to do is, for now, you can see those pink polygons are non-planar. We're going to look at the topology. This is the one that we were kind of working with just to block out the shape. And it's not bad. A lot of them are quads already, which is good. And as a mesh, most of it is perfectly fine. But it doesn't really have good edge flow. If I were to just wanted to select one edge, it usually does. And a lot of times with ZBrush does this, is that you get this kind of like spiraling that goes all the way around the model, which is kind of tricky when it comes to creating UV islands, because then you have to create a jagged island, or you have to kind of manually select select the edges one by one rather than just doing a loop selection. So it just adds more time down the line. Same with things like the edge, like if I were to go and select an edge, again, it's like if I wanted the UV island to perfectly follow this edge, that's ideally what we want, is the UV seams to follow the seam or the thin edge of a model, because when we're looking at something like this, we probably wouldn't be looking at it a view like this, or if we did, it's so small we wouldn't really notice. Where most of the time we'd be viewing the muscle, we'd be doing it head on from like the thickest part or from the back. And we can hide the UV seams in the areas where it's really thin, and we're probably not going to be looking at, or if we do, we're not really going to see much of it. So when we're laying out these polygon strips, it's really handy to first think about the areas that you'd be laying down your UV seams anyways. And a muscle like this, it's really just like it's a strip, you know, it's that has a slight curve to it. There's really not much more to it. It's just, you know, a rectangle that twists a little bit, that has a little bit of volume to it. So what I would do is I would leave this here in object mode. I would go to smooth shading. I turn on X-ray mode, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to start laying down strips that snap to this reference object using the polygon pen. This is kind of your main tool for retopology by hand in Cinema4D. If I go here and look at the options, I prefer edge mode the best. Each draw mode has slightly different options, but I think generally edge mode is kind of the, you know, Swiss Army knife of it. It's like kind of does everything pretty well. I like to leave on auto weld, and I like to leave on reproject result. What that's going to do is it's going to project the point to the polygons in the scene. So if I just start clicking, right, it lays down an edge. No new object's been created yet. This is just an edge. And I can either lay down another edge, or I can just click on this edge and hold Control and drag. And now we drag out an edge. And that creates a polygon. And you can see it's snapping to the surface because I have reproject result on. It's just called polygon. I can relabel it. I can do, oops. I know what I'm working with. And I also like to usually go in and do a custom color so I can see it against the gray of the reference object. So just a contrast color. And again, you can see why I like to have the X-ray on, because if I didn't have it on, it would kind of cover the polygons I'm laying down on top of it. Because the polygons I'm laying down when I'm retopologizing are going to be a lot more low poly, so I'm not going to be able to follow the form exactly. I just want to get the general silhouette of it. So that's why I leave on X-ray, so that way I can see through it, because you're going to have polygons that are just on the inside and are covered up. Another thing I like to do for viewing is, and also so I don't accidentally snap to something on the opposite side, is turn off backface culling. And what that is doing is it's just hiding the opposite normal side of the polygon. So the opposite side you can see is now hidden. This is the internal surface of the model that you wouldn't see. It just hides it from view so you can't accidentally snap a point to the inverse side of the model. Go back here. And when you're just kind of laying it out, you want it to be really big and almost, you know, comically, you know, simplified, because it'll save you time down the line. Again, that was turning pink because it was non-planar. I have mesh checking on. You don't really want to worry too much about that in the beginning. That's more something, the non-planar, you can kind of look at the end, because you're going to be working with big shapes, and you don't want to really be thinking about all that right away. And essentially, that's what the muscle is. It's just a strip that has a little bit of a curve to it. And from there, we can kind of do the other side. Again, hold Control, drag out. We're snapping to the surface. and we want it to be about the same as the other side so we can eventually connect them. So that's something we want to be aware of. A lot of times I'll try my best to keep things symmetrical front and back, the topology, just because it makes it easier for merging them at the end. And again, because I have auto weld on, I can just click and drag again, drag out a polygon. I can click that edge and it'll snap, and now it's merged with the other one. And now it's connected. Again, I'll do it the other side and just snap it. So now we have a hole, and instead of just going and dragging out one by one, another handy tool is the close polygon tool. And if I fill that hole, I'm in grid mode, it automatically knows it can look at the points and create quads based on that the topology I laid out. So that's really handy. And saves a bunch of time. But again, if you notice, let's say if I were to do it like this, I'll show an example real quick. If I go, and again, to delete polygons with the polypen tool, again, if I hold Control and it highlights the polygon, Control left mouse click, and that'll delete them. So let's say I do, I accidentally have something in here where I have an extra thing going on. So right now, if I count the edges here, if I do this, go to edge mode, UL, my heads-up display is saying I have 7 edges, so that's an odd number. If I go and try and fill that with the grid, you'll see I get a triangle that is an odd number. So if you see triangles popping up when you're using this tool, that means that you have an odd number. You need to go back, count your edges, either get rid of some or add some to make it an even number. Once you have it really roughly blocked out like this, then it's much easier after it's blocked out to then just simply add edge loops and then drag them into place. And again, every time you move something with the polypen tool, it's going to snap it to the surface. So now that we have more polygons, you can see as I snap things, more and more of it is appearing in front of the model because it's snapping to the surface. And it doesn't have to be perfect. A lot of times, you know, we're going to go back anyways once things are retopologized and do like that super high-end high-res sculpt, you know, with the striations. So there's still going to be a little bit of moving around, but as long as it's pretty close like this, that's kind of what we're looking for. Sometimes at the ends too, it's good to see what it'll look like subdivided. I'll add a subdivision surface, and I'll see, okay, when it's subdivided, you know, these edges get really smoothed out. So maybe I'll add a crease or an inset at the end. So I'll do something like that. You can see that holds its edge a little bit better, or I'll do an inset as well with the inset tool, like that. And again, anyways, because I'd probably want to extend this out a little bit where the muscle kind of flares out at the insertion. Might do UL to select, and then, you know, just bring it up a little bit and out, move it. I solo that. If I solo it now, you can see we get a much sharper edge. I'd probably smooth this out a little bit more and bring it out with it. But that's pretty much what we're looking for. And now we have a very easy to select the thin edge to lay down a seam, pretty much to UV map it. Now all we have to do is go into edge mode, go into edge selection or loop selection, and select it. And then essentially it's all we hit relax, and that's UV mapped already. Whereas before, with this, we'd have to kind of decide if I did the loop selection, you can see it goes around, but then it kind of cuts back in. I have to manually deselect and then go with like the path selection, go around this face and then down this way, and then it would just be jagged, a lot more manual work. So that's kind of the benefit of that. Another thing too for you for retopology is that it's really nice to have the retopoed surface follow the edges of things, just for deformation's sake. Animating, again, edge selection, UV mapping. You can see here the density of this isn't bad, but the edge right here, it kind of, again, it loops in a way that isn't easy to select for UV mapping. If I wanted to say I wanted to put the seam at the edge of the IT band here, and I start going with the path selection tool, you can see it starts to cut inwards on the inner surface. So now I have to kind of come back this way and then come back this way and then keep on going down. So essentially just manual work all the way down to select these edges, rather than having it retopologized and being able to just select one straight edge all the way down. I can just double click, and it selects it all the way down because I laid it out by hand and I said, okay, this is an important edge, so I want polygons to be perfectly in line with that edge. You can see here I have a complex pull. That means I have more than 5 edges. In this case, it's probably all right. Maybe we could go back and figure it out later. But because it's where the IT band kind of merges with the gluteus maximus, I think it's something we can get away with because it's kind of hidden and tucked away in a area where things are kind of merging anyways. But with something like this is a pretty complex object right here. My kind of process is that I just kind of go in and I just want to get it done first. I want to get everything laid out in a way that's mostly organized, and then kind of go back to it later. I feel like if I just kind of stick to one thing for too long, you end up not really having the best ideas. It's kind of like a you lose efficiency. So I just kind of block everything out and then move on to the next structure, and then I come back later and I say, okay, how can I fix maybe an area that I'm not super happy with? And I kind of lay it out in areas where, think of it in like faces. Like for example here, this is like an enclosed face. This is where it inserts onto the humerus, the femur. And so that I kind of laid out a strip of polygons that forms this kind of enclosed face. So it's very easy to kind of select, and then I could just say, unwrap this when I'm UV mapping. And that's kind of how we have to think with topology and UV mapping and all that stuff, is kind of break down complex forms into kind of simpler faces. And that's kind of evident on when you're doing something like a sphere. A sphere is just a perfectly round object. So it's kind of hard to imagine that as, quads. By default, we think of it more of a globe, where everything kind of merges at a pole. But this isn't really an ideal way to topologize a sphere, especially when we subdivide it, because this would be an example of a complex pole, a vertex that has more than 5 edges. And you can see when we subdivide a bunch, we get this weird kind of sunbeam looking thing happening. So you don't really want to think of it as a globe where everything kind of merges at a pole. But you can think of it as a cube that just has all the edges flattened out. And that's kind of what they offer. Here, you can see this sphere is much better topologized as a cube if we're going to use it for a subdivision workflow. When I subdivide it, we have little poles here, but we don't get that weird sun halo effect thing going on, because it's topologized a little bit better. And when you break it down, really all it is, if I take down the segments, is it's just a cube that has, um, 4 sides smoothed out. So if I were to, do this by hand, I would kind of find those areas first. I would lay down a strip like this. So I'd start by doing something like that, and then I would fill that, doing the grid fill, and then kind of work my way around, and then I'd start with the other face, and then the other face, and then the other face. I think the last thing that's handy is that when I'm doing something more complex, even this that might have benefited from it, the gluteus maximus group here, but something that really benefited from this was the kind of the hamstring group. I solo that. This is all one object. These are all merged together. I haven't retopologized these all yet. I've started, I think, on some, but I haven't finished. But they all kind of merge together, and it's kind of hard to get around and view them. A thing that I like to do is set up selections. So by just doing the selecting polygons, I can do like a loop selection and then a fill selection, and then go into select, store selection. And then it creates this tag right here that stores that selection I just made. So instead of having to break this up, I can go into this selection tag and just hit solo. And now it's still connected, but I'm only working on one thing at a time. And that allows me to hide things that I don't need without trying to work in, X-ray mode where you're trying to look through something or separate it and then re-weld it. I can kind of solo the different parts of it and retopologize that way, because it really helps to be able to see your model as you go. You can see this one, I haven't gotten to this one yet. It has some complex poles and some non-planar geometry that I can clean up later. But the geometry, the modeling, mesh checking kind of alerts me right away to the areas that could probably use the most attention.
I have no idea who made those terrible models. It was probably Nick or Alec.
Well, that was Andrew saying that he has no idea who made the models. The models themselves aren't, I mean, they're probably 80% of the way there, and a lot of times you would start off with something much worse, maybe way more.
The sad thing is that's after I already cleaned up the topology, so. Interesting.
Well, I mean, there really is no like one single right way to do it. It's just kind of, laying out polygons, looking at it, saying, is there a different way to do it? Can I merge something here? Can I change something there? Until you get something that, that's pretty clean. And it is difficult in ZBrush because you can't really look into something. You can't, there's certain things you can't really do, like in here, in Cinema4D. So it is tricky. But yeah, that's kind of the gist of it. That's kind of what I wanted to go over today. I hope that was a good overview.
Super useful.
Are there cases? Yeah. Thanks for doing this, Jack. And
Actually, so one sec. Let me just see if I can turn my volume so Jamie
yeah.
can hear.
I'm just wondering if there's a threshold between when, like for example, in this case, rather than reconstructing it essentially with new polygons to get a clean mesh to start with, versus going through and trying to solve the issues that you see. For example, you've got non-planar polygons here, cutting them, merging them, welding them, versus I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna reconstruct this from scratch. Talk about like how do you approach a model and just determine what workflow you're gonna do? Like, do you just rebuild them all, or are some of them salvageable and you're like, I can deal with these issues individually?
Yeah. So yeah, the question was kind of the workflow of, is it better to simply take the model that we have and just try and fix the issues by deleting polygons, merging things, or just simply starting from scratch and laying out one by one. And I have tried, sometimes it seems easier to, rather than start from scratch, just try and fix them in this one area. But usually the issue that always happens is kind of like what I was saying with poles, is that you really can't get around them. You're not really getting rid of them, you're just moving them. So if you end up trying to just fix them in one area, what you'll find is that you probably just move them a little bit further up, then you try and fix them further up, and then you just push them further up again until you get to the top of the model. And really all you've done is just you've done the whole thing anyways. You just kind of pushed everything one by one. And it kind of constrains your thinking a little bit too, because you try and conform to what was already done rather than thinking of, the best thing that is possible, is what I find. So sometimes it's easier just to start from scratch than try and fix something in one area, especially too because maybe you'll find I don't have an even number of edges, so I have a triangle, so I try and put it in an edge loop. But when I try and put it in an edge loop, maybe it's not, it's like one of those wrapping situations where instead of going like around, you can see here, so like let's say this was an odd number and I need to put in an edge loop. The edge loop kind of goes through a ton of different polygons because it's not forming a single loop around the model. It's coming to the top and forming more of a spiral than a single loop. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's kind of why I find it almost doesn't really save any time to try and salvage something that isn't working. It's better to just use it as a reference point for a surface and then just lay in the polygons by hand. And again, start by the loop, figure out which loops are important to the model and to the selection, lay those out, fill them, and then merge them.
Right.
Because usually trying to fix something will just lead to doing it by hand.
More problems. Yeah, you're just procrastinating the real issues.
At least that's
so
what I found.
On this model, what edge loop? Walk me through your thought process for where would you start laying polygons in for this one?
So for this one, I would probably do like a loop where it connects, where it inserts onto the bone. I would do like an enclosed one. Right now, it's kind of just going straight across. Essentially, what that would look like is it almost looks like an inset. Sorry, Nick asked how I would go about starting to retopologize something like this. And I wouldn't do this. I'm just showing this to quickly show what it would look like. Is I would lay it out by hand by doing something that would look like. Oops, didn't select them all. So something that would look like this to start.
Mm-hmm.
I would go around like that. Then I would fill it with polygons in a way that looks like a relatively uniform grid. And then I would look at the muscle and kind of figure out like what's going on with it, like where is the kind of the edge that's the thinnest, and kind of like right here, I think. So I'd probably lay a loop that kind of follows this surface of the muscle. So you kind of like where it becomes thin, where it becomes tendon. This, I think, would be the most important edge loop that needs to be like a single loop that would separate the model into front and back. So I just go along and kind of lay a strip down that would kind of separate it from front and back, and it would kind of probably turn a little bit here as we go up because it kind of twists slightly. And I'd get to the top, and then I'd lay another kind of inset loop. It's a little bit trickier up here because it's so thin, but it's still doable.
So when you've done with these connected muscles, after you've tackled this one, are you looking at where you started and ended your edge loops for this model, where they connect at the top? Are you less concerned about that because it's not really visible in the final model?
Like where it would connect to like the bone?
Well, because is this one of the hamstring grouped models, right? So you've got other hamstring muscle shapes attached to this one that you've hidden right now. So when you show the rest of those, you're looking at you do one. And then are you looking for ways to extend that edge loop to start the next shape in that group?
Right. For this one, it's tricky, because we do have hidden ones, and we would have to be aware of that. And like we would probably want to unhide it. Maybe we would set a new selection. So like, for example, we could have, so it connects up here. So really what's important is that it connects to this section. And then once we have that laid out, then we can just start building this muscle based off of what we've already done.
Right, okay.
And we could say, well, now we have to build this model, but we'd have to understand that we'd have to have 8 edges to start with.
Right,
we'd have to connect.
Right, so that you kind of pick one to tackle first, and that informs where you start the next one, and you're thinking about edge loops from the first one in the group and extending those into the next one.
Right. Yeah. So for these complex muscles, we have to kind of be aware of the rest of them as we go. Yeah, and generally, this is like more of a advanced case. A lot of times, this might not be the norm, but for when it is, yeah, you would have to be aware of what you're doing, and always make sure to go simple first. Break it down as much as you can, and then add detail. Because when you try and add too much detail in the beginning, it just compounds the time. Instead of taking like half an hour to retopologize, it takes like 3 hours.
Right.
And like you think you did all this work, but really you were just zoomed in, and then you zoom out and you realize, wow, I just laid all these polygons, but I only covered like a fifth of the muscle, and I have to do all the rest. So yeah, it's especially when you're starting out, you work bigger than you think you need. It's going to feel like you're like laying down polygons that are way too big, but in reality, you're probably just right.
Okay. Yeah.
It's always easier to add edge loops at the end than in the beginning, and then two, when you add at the end, once you set up good edge loops, when you add in an extra one, it's going to be again another closed loop rather than a spiral one, which just adds editability to the muscle and makes it clean.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So no, it was a lot of technical stuff, but I hope overall it kind of made sense. Just to kind of, because it is an easy process to kind of split up work, whereas a lot of things that we do with like animation, it's hard to really share that because one person has to animate the start before you can animate the end, whereas with Retopology, it's kind of easy to hand off bits and pieces. So hopefully that gave everyone like a good introduction to it and the process that I use for it, because it makes things like rigging and animating and texturing and UVing way easier down the line, rather than having to select every edge by hand to make a UV island, or realizing that you have non-manifold geometry or this or that.
Yeah, this is great, Jack. Thank you very much for walking us through this. And I can tell you've done a lot of work to figure out how to do this correctly. And it is itself a lot of work, but it's the right work to do, and that's an important question to answer. And I think you did a great job.
Thank you.